Okay, look, welcome everybody to this relaunched webinar series following on from the success of our online annual conference. Today we're going to talk around issues on devolution. And so I'm very pleased to say we've got two excellent guest speakers as well. The running order of events is going to be a slight change. I'm going to introduce Dr. Arantxa Gomez Arana, who's a senior lecturer in industrial relations and formerly a fellow with us at CBS, now a sort of guest fellow. And she's going to talk around her research first on Gibraltar and devolution. Of course, a forgotten piece of the UK and its external territories, of course, is Gibraltar. But in reality, another piece of the United Kingdom and associated places that share a land border with another EU state. So that's still very interesting, and the status of Gibraltar going forward. But before I kick over to Arantxa, I'm also joined by Professor Jeff Whittam from Glasgow Caledonian University, who is a former colleague of mine as well, and we have currently collaborated on some research comparing voter attitudes to devolution and Brexit, looking at a snapshot across the West Midlands and Scotland. So we're going to talk about our findings from that research circa 9:30. Over to you, Arantxa, for the next half hour to talk us through your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Can you hear me fine? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. Yes. Thank you very much to Birmingham City University for inviting me to this talk, and thank you very much to the Center for Brexit Studies. As Alex said, I used to work there, and I'm still obviously in touch and collaborating as much as I can. So today my presentation is on Gibraltar. So I would like to share my slides with you. So please bear with me while I do that. What I'm going to discuss today is Gibraltar and devolution, obviously. And as we know, everything started when we had the referendum 4 years ago. And as we know, Gibraltar decided to vote against the idea of leaving the European Union with up to 96%. So you had the big majority of the society in Gibraltar saying that they would like to stay in the European Union. As we know now, however, we are still, the UK has left the European Union, and Gibraltar has negotiated together with the UK and Spain a special protocol that was included in the withdrawal agreement. And since then, they've been negotiating on several issues. So as part of the withdrawal agreement, as we know, there are several committees, and you have the list of them there. You can see highlighted is the committees on issues related to the implementation of the protocol on Gibraltar. So Gibraltar is not the only committee that has been created in order to deal with very sensitive topics, such as obviously the border with Northern Ireland or citizen rights. So in terms of Gibraltar, when it comes to the protocol and the withdrawal agreement, there were several points that were highlighted in the agreement that highlights to some extent some of the problems and some of the issues that will be discussed until pretty much the 31st of December of 2020. As we know, the United Kingdom is responsible for Gibraltar's external relations. And as we know, the European Union law is applicable to Gibraltar. That is important to take into consideration when it comes to the negotiations that have taken place, because the United Kingdom is the one negotiating with Spain the border with Gibraltar and other matters. However, representatives of Gibraltar have joined this negotiation team on the UK side. This is important to clarify because it is an extremely sensitive topic, the status of Gibraltar, the current one, the past one, and whatever happens in the future in relation to both the UK and Spain. As we know, this has been a very sensitive topic since the Utrecht Treaty, and it has not been resolved according to at least one side of the story, in this case, Spain. relation to several topics that are quite sensitive still these days is the issue of smuggling and fraud over the border. And in relation to, for example, issues around tobacco and other products when they cross the border, as well as cooperation in the area of environmental matters and police cooperation over customs and security matters. As we know, on the Spanish side of Gibraltar, we have Campo de Gibraltar, which is an area that unfortunately is suffering from several levels of criminality. In the withdrawal agreement, we can see that there were several articles included in relation to Gibraltar. One of them was in relation to citizens' rights. As we know, around 15,000 workers crosses the border between Spain and Gibraltar every single day. Therefore, it's extremely important for both sides, for both Spain and Gibraltar, to reach an agreement on citizens' rights. The idea is that before the 31st of December, how these frontier workers are going to not just travel and cross the border every day, but have access to a tax system that works for both. It has something that has to be still decided. They also agreed to exchange information on a regular basis, and they develop committees in order to monitor and develop further employment and labor conditions. Under Article 2 of the withdrawal agreement, we have the issue of the airport. As we know, the airport in Gibraltar is a sensitive topic because of the way it was built and the area on which it was built. If you have read the literature on this matter, you will be familiar with the idea that on the Spanish side, they claim that the land that has been used to build the airport, in theory, belongs to Spain, but almost a century ago, that airport was built and is still working. For those who have been to Gibraltar, you will know that for the airport to work, every time a plane lands or takes over, they have to stop the traffic between the border and the rest of Gibraltar. Another committee was created to discuss a satisfactory agreement on the use of the Gibraltar airport. Article 3 is related to the fiscal matters, and as I have said previously, there are many issues that have been a long-term problem for both sides of the border. And one of them is the issue of taxes and transparency around taxes. As I will explain later on, they managed to reach an agreement on fiscal policy, and that was agreed a year ago, and it has been approved by the Spanish political institutions in September, last September. In relation to this article, I would like to highlight, as I said previously, that apart from the issues around taxes and around companies, residences, and the payment of taxes, there is also highlighted the issue of tobacco one more time. The issue around tobacco has been considered a very, very long-term problem, extremely long-term problem. And they are also negotiating the difference in price that should be allowed on both sides of the border, as I will explain in a minute. There are other matters related to tobacco, as you can see there. And in relation to the tax system, other aspects that are heavily influenced is the price of alcohol and petrol. In relation to Article 4, this article is not very ambitious, as we can see, and the idea is to develop further cooperation and coordination through committees in order to deal with issues such as waste management, air quality, and scientific research and fishing. The fishing area is also a sensitive topic because of issues around water limitations and water ownership. In relation to Article 5, as I explained at the very beginning, the issue of police cooperation is essential around the border, but also is going to become, one more time, a sensitive topic if Gibraltar joins Schengen. I will explain that in a minute. The main goal here is to ensure that further coordination and cooperation between competent authorities is developed around the border of Gibraltar. As I mentioned previously, on the Spanish side, you have Campo de Gibraltar, where the level of criminality is important, is relevant, and any cooperation on that area, on that matter, is extremely necessary and welcome. And then Article 6 is in relation to the committees that were created. So where are we in relation to negotiations? Well, when the negotiations started, you may remember that in Spain first we had a government that it was led by the Popular Party, Partido Popular, and at the time of the referendum, the outcome of the referendum. And then we had the party of Pedro Sánchez, the current president of Spain, leading Spanish politics. Both parties emphasizes the idea that Spain should have a particular status when it comes to Brexit negotiations around Gibraltar. There is no disagreement within Spanish politics. The issue of Gibraltar in Spanish politics has been ongoing since Franco's times, and it certainly improved with the arrival of democracy after Franco's passing away. However, it has not been fully resolved. Therefore, it's still a topic in Spanish media that is reviewed and discussed on a regular basis. In relation to the negotiations, the British and Spanish delegations, they decided to have regular meetings. And again, as a sensitive point here was the role of Gibraltar. Spain wanted to have a discussion with Britain, and Gibraltar wanted to be part of those discussions. So the sensitive solution was to include Gibraltar representatives as part of the British delegation. Again, extremely sensitive, the topic around status, past status, present, and potential future status. I would like to highlight, for example, what happened in July 2020. There was a meeting between the Spanish foreign minister and the prime minister of Gibraltar that brought many opinions within Spain, and those parties that are considered conservative, such as Popular Party and Vox, they asked for explanations on this matter. Again, the moment you consider Gibraltar as an equal in terms of as an independent country, the desires in Spain on future co-sovereignty or sovereignty for some people over Gibraltar will be watered down to some extent. So issues around who should be in those meetings, who should be leading those meetings, and who should not be included in those meetings has been an extremely sensitive topic. The main goal on the Spanish side when it comes to the negotiations here is to improve the socioeconomic difference between Gibraltar and Campo de Gibraltar. We need to remember that unemployment in Campo de Gibraltar is close to 40%, and the level of inequality on both sides comparatively is very, very significant. The issue of sovereignty or co-sovereignty over Gibraltar is something that is not being discussed and is purposely being put aside. It's something that neither Spain or Gibraltar wants to discuss it during the Brexit negotiations. The reach a fiscal agreement, this is on the positive side. We managed to reach a fiscal agreement in March 2019 and between Gibraltar and the UK, including including Gibraltar. And in Spain, going through all the political discussions and agreements necessary was finally approved and agreed in September 2020. This is in relation to domestic politics. The fiscal agreement is the first document between the UK and Spain, and I would like to highlight the first document between the UK and Spain after the Treaty of Utrecht over Gibraltar. As I said, this is a very long-term issue and quite sensitive around the discourse on decolonization or independence of other regions, both in the UK and in Spain. We shouldn't forget the ongoing discussions in Scotland, but I will leave that discussion for my colleagues for later on, but also the ongoing discussions around Catalonia in Spain. There are some pros and cons in relation to this fiscal agreement. In relation to the positive outcomes of this agreement is that the fiscal presidency has been agreed on how many days you need to spend in Spain to be considered Spain as your fiscal presidency, both for people and for companies. And however, when it comes to having a full agreement on fiscal policy in relation to Gibraltar, there is no concrete agreement. The main goal on the Spanish side is to deal with the fiscal differences between both regions. Conscious of the time. So in relation to the deadlines, we all are aware of how close we are to the 31st of December 2020 when the transition period ends. And that is something that's putting pressure on the negotiations between both the UK and Spain in relation to Gibraltar. That explains to some extent why they had a bilateral meeting a few months ago, as I explained it recently. At this point, the main goal seems to be pragmatism. We should not forget that, as I mentioned, you have 15,000 workers crossing the border every single day. And disruption over that is something that both sides do not want. If it can be avoided through pragmatic agreements, it looks like it will take place. One of the main goals is to maintain free movement through the border. Again, a very sensitive topic if we consider what's going on with the Northern Irish border. That takes me to the discussion of Schengen, and as I will discuss in a minute. Spain and Gibraltar representatives, both sides, are trying to reach a practical deal that will limit disruption for thousands of cross-border workers between Spain and the territory when the UK leaves the EU single market on December 31st. This quotation comes from the Financial Times that has been covering these pieces of news quite recently. And one more time, they emphasize that they are not discussing the issue of sovereignty. The only way to reach a successful agreement is by putting aside the topic of sovereignty. In relation to British overseas territory, as is the case of Gibraltar, the main idea is to keep close ties with the European Union, the way that it was before Brexit. So in a way, the goal is to keep things the way they are before the transition period ends. And as they quote, Gibraltar would like to become part of Europe's Schengen free movement area and eventually the EU's customs union, to neither of which it has ever belonged. And this is a very sensitive topic because, again, if you look at what's happening with the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, the same solution is not being applied, as we know. So we have asymmetries here in relation to Brexit negotiations around borders. In relation to border controls, if Gibraltar joins Schengen, then it could benefit from Frontex. If Gibraltar joins Schengen, when it comes to policing the border, Spanish police could cooperate, or they could use members of Frontex, which include different nationalities within the European Union, including the Spanish one. Again, a sensitive topic around who should police the border together with Gibraltar police forces. If Gibraltar joins Schengen, it will be a different scenario to the UK. The UK is not part of Schengen. If that happens, Gibraltar will start a different journey compared to the UK when it comes to the European Union, and different degrees of, if not integration, at least cooperation. In relation to police cooperation around smuggling, as I mentioned before, very long-term issue. One of the ideas in the agreement is that the price of tobacco, the difference should not be over 32%. Currently is over 48%. In fact, 48% is the minimum in terms of price differences. So border controls include several things: smuggling of tobacco, smuggling of many other items, and border controls over workers, and around EU mechanisms for border controls, such as Schengen mechanism. I cannot emphasize enough how sensitive and important is this matter. In the area of security, there is not much discussion. Spain, like the rest of the European Union, would like to develop further cooperation with both the UK the UK and Gibraltar around Brexit. However, nothing seems to happen in this area. In relation to Gibraltar, we should not forget that several issues around water borders have taken place quite recently, and a few years ago also is becoming, again, a long-term issue. And it seems that if there is no an agreement over water borders after Brexit, this kind of small conflicts and issues will only become worse and will put the current relations between Gibraltar and Spain in a difficult position. I would like to end with a couple of final points. The issue of Gibraltar and the British media, in my experience, is not being covered, and it has not been covered even before Brexit. However, in relation to Spanish media, it's been covered for decades and decades on a regular basis. My perception is that the main goal is for Gibraltar to keep things the way they are, and the same for the UK in relation to Gibraltar when it comes to sovereignty matters and integration matters. On the Spanish side, however, Spain never gave up the idea of developing co-sovereignty over Gibraltar. However, from a pragmatic point of view, both Spain and Gibraltar decided to put aside that topic for the future. And my final point will be that until the 31st of December, we will not know what's the final outcome in relation to Gibraltar and Spain. However, it looks like pragmatism is going to take place, and they will come up with temporary solutions that could become long-term solutions around the border. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Thank you very much to everyone. And if you have any questions or comments, please let me know.
Thank you, Arantxa. That was a fascinating presentation. We have at least one question here from, this is from Kevin. What happens when those who work in Spain but live in Gibraltar are sick at work? Will they be covered by the Spanish health system and vice versa from the 1st of January next year?
Well, unfortunately, until the final agreement on workers is decided, we will we will not know. But in theory, looking at the Spanish side, the Spanish health system, the public Spanish health system is free for everyone. You can go there on holidays, and if you have an accident, you go to the doctor, and they do not charge you, no matter of your nationality. It's completely and absolutely free for everyone. In relation to having a regular GP and a regular visits to a hospital, that will have to be decided by the agreement between Gibraltar and Spain. But from an emergency point of view, Spain offers completely free health care. So I will not be too worried about health matters on the Gibraltar side of things.
Okay. We'd still encourage, listeners, viewers to please post in any questions you may have while we run through the session. Of course, you just need to use the Q&A section on the Zoom facility. So please do keep questions coming in. We have another question here from Tony. Does Gibraltar want to join the EU Customs Union as your slide implied? Presumably the UK would not want this. So answer any thoughts there, please.
My perception is that Gibraltar potentially would like to join the Customs Union as a way of resolving many issues with the border. My perception will be that the UK would rather that this doesn't happen. But pragmatism needs to take place. It's a very small border. I don't know if you have been there in person or anyone in the audience. It's a very small border. And pragmatism, as it has taken place for decades and decades around the border, will have to take place. So my perception is just my perception is that Gibraltar will likely end up probably joining the Customs Union. I have another question there from Kevin.
Yes, yeah, they're coming in now. I mean, if you can see them, yes. Please feel free to answer.
Yes, of course, I'll go through them. So, Kevin, can you elaborate more on the airport? Well, the airport, again, for those who have been there in person, you will see that when you go, if you drive through Spain, you have the border there. And once you cross the border, you have obviously a road that goes all the way into the town of Gibraltar. Now, between the border here and the town, this road, you have the airport. So when the plane arrives, the traffic there has to stop. And that tells you how complicated is the future of the airport. There are very few flights allowed from the airport, and they go to, obviously, to the UK. And it doesn't have truly the capacity to have many more flights. First, because you cannot stop the traffic every so often, but also because there is physically no space. If we go back to the history of the airports, this is during the war times where it was developed over a land, as I said before, that in theory belongs to Spain. So that the controversy over the airport has not gone away, because Spain claims still that that airports should not be part of Gibraltar. We shouldn't forget that Spain has many other airports not that far away from Gibraltar. You have the airport of Malaga, and so it's not a lack of airports. The problem is the way the land that in theory belongs to Spain that has been used for the airport. I have another question for Kevin, if I read correctly. And do goods destined for Spain pass through the port in Gibraltar? Because, yes. So if I understand correctly, your question is that goods goods that go to Spain pass through the port in Gibraltar. Well, obviously it depends where they come from, but yes, of course, if I mean, you have different ports, so obviously if they go through Gibraltar, yes, of course, if they go through Malaga or through Cadiz, or yes, of course they have to go through it. Would it legally be possible for Gibraltar to join the customs unions? Yes, of course, it is legally possible. It has to be agreed in the negotiation. It has to be agreed on both sides. And my perception is, as I said before, my perception is that it's not something that perhaps the UK would like to happen, perhaps. Again, if you don't apply that to the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, why would you apply it to Gibraltar? That could be a way of thinking about it, a way of looking at it. But again, pragmatism is going to be the main goal. Okay, so I have a question from Dick Rogers. I've been there. It's small, but is this not the Northern Ireland dilemma again? Yes and no. Yes and no. Yes, because it is a border, obviously, and you have workers on both sides, so it is a border the same way. And yes, you need to deal with the future management of the border. The main difference is that because of the size, the impact, economic impact, cannot be compared with the economic impact of the border in Northern Ireland. But also because of the histories of Northern Ireland and Gibraltar are very, very different. And without getting too involved in Northern Irish politics, we shouldn't forget of the role of the Republic of Ireland and the history of the island. Is not that sensitive in relation to Gibraltar, is not that complicated. And from a security point of view, there is a strong cooperation. I mean, we're talking of NATO countries. So it is similar from a pragmatic point of view, but historically it's very different Northern Irish politics from Gibraltar.
If we take the last question there from Kevin and Carolina, and then we'll move on, because we can always come back and you can type answers as well.
So Kevin, will Spain use access to fishing in UK water as a bargaining tool in negotiations over Gibraltar? That's a very interesting question. That's a very interesting question. Everything is up for negotiation as far as I'm aware of. And the topic around fishing is extremely sensitive for the UK and also for Spain, as we know from historical events. Can you negotiate something in two different forums? Informally, I'm sure you can. Formally, in theory, the negotiations between Gibraltar and the UK and Spain is on one side, and the negotiations between the European Union and the UK are on another side. Informally, I guess that anything is possible. And the last question from Carolina, are there ambitions among the people of Gibraltar to aim for complete independence from the UK or a closer association with Spain? That is, again, a really interesting question, but if we don't have polls around the topic, I'm cautious about saying yes or not. My perception will be that if you have 96% of the society voting in favor of staying with the European Union, you clearly don't want to break up from the European Union and consequently from Spain in that sense. There was a poll a few years ago around for young people in Gibraltar, and it seems that many people who are quite young will consider move to Spain if the situation in Gibraltar became difficult. My perception, again, this is just my perception, is that from a pragmatic point of view, Gibraltar and Spain will develop all kinds of agreements and treaties and cooperation agreements. However, the idea of sovereignty, Gibraltar, I don't see them giving it away in relation to Spain, but perhaps they could seek for it in relation to the UK. In other words, Gibraltar perhaps might try to become more independent from the UK. Therefore, we need to look at devolution here and so on. But I do not see them looking for co-sovereignty in relation to Spain at all. And the discourse of the Prime Minister is very clear in relation to that topic in Gibraltar. I think that is my final answer in relation to these questions. You can always email me if you have more questions or comments, but I think at this point I need to give the floor to Alex.
Thank you, Arantxa, and thanks again for that fascinating excuse me, presentation. Just a historical reference there in the Treaty of Utrecht, of course, which ended the War of the Spanish Succession, which saw the emergence of Great Britain as a union of England and Scotland. And of course, as part of the booty of being on the winning side in that war, Britain took Gibraltar and also at the time Mallorca, I think, which of course was returned to Spain, but Gibraltar remains as a remnant of empire to this day. So the backdrop to that in itself is quite fascinating in terms of the geopolitical shift. And of course, you know, when we talk about a global Britain, you know, in the rhetoric of the government of today, you know, one always sees musings over the residual memory of empire, as it were. But look, thank you for that. We're going to move on now to our presentation, myself and Jeff. I'm just going to try and bring it up. Right. We're going to share this presentation, myself and Jeff. Jeff is going to speak to the Scottish dimension and also chip in as appropriate on more general reflections on devolution or localism or community empowerment, as it were. But our talk, which will take us through the remainder of the approximately 50 minutes remaining to us in the official session, is on Brexit and devolution, understanding voter perceptions and attitudes to feeling left behind. Now, in essence, this research is reporting on a number of focus groups that we did in the West Midlands, specifically Dudley and Lichfield, local authorities, and in terms of Scotland, Glasgow City Council and East Dunbartonshire, which is to Glasgow what Lichfield is to Birmingham, you might say. So in order to set the scene, the 2016 referendum vote result, of course, in terms of the academic debate, has been sort of dominated by two key hypotheses. The first is that people look at the vote result in terms of the demographic explanations that seek to highlight or focus on variables such as your age, your ethnicity, how much money you earn, and of course your education, with the inference there that people who voted leave were, how shall I say, but on average, people who voted remain were more likely to have higher education profiles than people who voted leave. The older you were, the more likely you were to vote leave. If you're of a white British ethnic background, as such, you're more likely to vote leave. And if you're on lower incomes, you're more likely to vote leave. And that's not to say that a leave person is low educated, poor and old. It's just demographic indicators that on their own are associated with a higher propensity to vote leave. The other explanations seek to look at so-called place-based hypotheses that look at the geographic unevenness of the referendum vote. And of course, it was, in the sense that a majority of people in England, outside of London, clear majority, voted to leave the EU, whereas in Scotland, some 60% of the turnout was to vote to remain to stay in the EU. Northern Ireland, a majority to stay in the EU. Wales, majority to leave the EU. But even within that, when you go down and drill down to the more local level, and you take the city of Birmingham as an example, Birmingham City Council area, in aggregate, Birmingham had about a 50.5% vote split in favour of leave, but that concealed very sharp differences within the city of Birmingham, so that outer suburbs like Northfield had in excess of a 60% vote leave, whereas the inner suburbs, the suburbs with strong ethnic minorities, Kings Heath, Moseley, Edgbaston, Ladywood, these areas had very strong Remain majorities. And you can see that sort of correlated with the types of demographic indicators I've just mentioned. But the place-based hypotheses, in essence, talk around notions of people who feel left behind or otherwise places that don't matter, to coin Andreas Rodriguez Pose, who's a famous academic who researches on the subject. This notion that the peri-urban fringes, the coastal towns in England, fishing communities, etc., that you would see that the sort of vote result as a a revolt against so-called metropolitan elites, which you sort of see journalists or academics or leading politicians castigated as. But like I said, those arguments are problematic when considering the nature of the vote across the UK home nations, because whilst you have communities which may score highly on certain indices of multiple deprivation, be it in terms of income, health, etc., education, the fact remains that similar communities in Scotland, that is, communities when you look at the demographics, are almost identical, displayed sharply divergent vote patterns. There are places in Glasgow which are very much like, say, Dudley, where there was a solid Leave majority. They have the same sort of demographic profile, and yet the majority of voters in those constituencies voted to stay in the EU. And you find similar divergences elsewhere. And so we tried to get to grips with this question, because no matter what your educational profile in Scotland, you were more likely to vote to stay in the EU. And what we were trying to ask here is, why is that? Why was it so divergent in terms of the results profile? And if we just take 5 areas as an example here, I hope you can all see that. I might put that on full screen so you can see it better. East Dunbartonshire is an area much like Lichfield. It's dominated by middle-class professionals. And you can see there in terms of the age profile, the educational profile, incomes, incidences of those with no formal qualifications, proportion of white British. You can see there that in East Dunbartonshire, only 28% of voters voted to leave the EU, whereas in Lichfield it was 58%. Now, Lichfield is not one that would immediately come to mind in terms of an area characterised by the so-called working class who voted to leave the EU. It's a reasonably affluent area. It's got pockets of deprivation. And again, if we take the urban areas, which people see as being poorer, the parts of Glasgow most strongly compatible with Dudley Borough Council are Glasgow South West and Glasgow East. That Glasgow East, if you look at the indicators there, makes Dudley look quite well off. And yet, again, you see this sharp divergence in the Leave vote share. About 40% in those Glasgow neighbourhoods compared to 67% across Dudley. But yet, similar sort of demographic profiles. And so we try to ask ourselves, is there something else going on here? And so what we wanted to do here was to try and explore the notion of, well, if people feel left behind, why is that? Is it something to do with the nature of how empowered they feel, particularly in terms of the governance structures across the UK? Because they're very different. In Scotland, you have a devolved administration in the form of the Holyrood Parliament, which enjoys substantial autonomy to set policy in areas such as health, including public health. How many people in England who would be aware that Scotland could set its own policies in response to COVID-19, for example, would still be a surprise to many. But of course, Scotland also enjoys substantial autonomy in terms of transport, spending and policy, higher education. Students in Scottish undergrads, they don't get tuition fees, for example. And so therefore we try to ask this notion of, well, England is a very strong centralised state. Westminster pretty much has all power. It's not the people who are sovereign in this country, it's Parliament. And therefore whether a lacuna of political arrangements at the regional level may be a factor. And so these were the sort of questions we wanted to tease out in so-called similar left behind places. So we conducted focus groups in those said municipalities, between August and October of this year, so fairly recent. We managed to do 3 in Dudley Metropolitan Borough Council. We conducted 2 with residents in Lichfield, 2 in total across Glasgow City Council, and 1 in East Dunbartonshire. And that generated a total of 38 participants, of which 7 said they voted Leave. And slight typo there, 29 voted Remain, not 31. One of those did not vote, which is interesting in itself, and the other one was too young to have voted at the time. Now, I should say here, of course, that in terms of the representativeness of the sample, in terms of educational profile, in terms of age, gender, you know, there's a fairly good spread there, even split between men and women, good age profile all the way from the very young to the relatively old, and a similar spread in terms of educational profile. And yes, a few of the Leave participants did have degrees, so we are not trying to stereotype a Leave vote here as being poorly educated, far from it. That said, it is more difficult to get people who voted Leave to come and participate in the research. You know, we've done preliminary work in this regard over the years. We did a succession of town hall meetings a few years ago, and we tried to promote the work on Facebook, and it was, you know, the degree of suspicion towards our motives was quite apparent. And of course, the notion that for some, you know, we voted to Leave, we've left, what more is there to say? And of course, the other abiding reality is more structural. When you're trying to do a focus group with people, you're trying to juggle that around busy work commitments. And it may simply be for poorer people in particular, they don't have the luxury at the time to afford this sort of research, but that is what it is. That said, we think we've got a fairly good snapshot here, and even in terms of our Leave voting participants, I think allowed us to get a good spread of the views that inform their voting decisions. So, within those focus groups, we use a semi-structured interview format, so that if there was something of particular interest to follow up on, we could. And in so doing, we identified 3 key themes that emerged from the research. The first is trying to understand the Brexit vote from the perspective of those who voted Leave and those who voted Remain. We tried to explore the notion of feeling left behind, and then, therefore, to try and explore people's attitudes to devolution, and in particular, to see whether there was an appetite for further devolution. And I think that's one thing that the comparison of the West Midlands really brings out. So I'm going to split these slides with Jeff as well, who will contribute on the Scottish angle, as he's based in Glasgow. He's better placed to comment on that than I am. In terms of the West Midlands, then, what we did see again was that migration was seen as a key issue in terms of putting pressure on public services, competing for scarce resources, and could exacerbate the relative deprivation of an area. Now, I mean, it's very difficult to pin down people's precise motives on migration. You know, clearly there is elements of, maybe strong elements of racism and xenophobia out there, but the sort of narrative that we were encountering was more in terms of, you know, don't get me wrong, but, you know, my children have to go to school and we're struggling to get a place. So in my mind, rather than blaming austerity for that, for example, you know, migrants were seen as a visible target. Others talked about sovereignty and being able to trade with who we want. Now, I mean, one respondent made a comment which was that, well, you know, now that we've left the EU, we can trade with the rest of the world. I mean, you know, that's not correct. You know, I mean, we trade with the rest of the world as it is, but it was interesting to see these sort of comments emerge. And of course, simple Brexit fatigue. You know, when Boris Johnson and Cummings highlighted on the notion of get Brexit done, it was very clear from some of our respondents that they, you know, in last December's election voted Conservative simply for that reason. Indeed, I'm going to share some direct quotes with you here from participants. I voted Conservative last year because I was just bored of hearing about bloody Brexit all the time. But to be honest, I'd never voted for them before. And I'm not being funny, but if I'd known that coronavirus was around the corner, then, you know, Jesus Christ, I absolutely wouldn't have voted for them because they've been just dreadful through this. So the message to get Brexit done did have some resonance. But, I mean, interestingly, the same individual in exploring their thoughts around Brexit and the prospect of disruption to the economy, this person had a master's degree, by the way, said that they thought, well, as long as business had made the necessary preparations, then the disruption should be minimal. Now, it's a reasonable comment to make, you know. Surveys suggest that, of course, for business, that's a particular problem, especially with COVID-19. But I thought that was an interesting point in itself. So businesses made the necessary preparation. For others, you know, in trying to understand what they thought the likely impact would be in leaving the single market and the customs union at the end of this year, they did acknowledge that they thought, yeah, there would be some disruption in the short term, but we'll get through it. Now I'll leave it to you to decide as to what extent you may think that's wishful thinking, but it's a perception. It's a valid perception. If that's how people feel, that's how they feel. Jeff, I'll hand over to you in terms of Scotland here. Can you see the slide there?
Sure. Thanks, Alex. Yeah. I mean, the comment you were making earlier, Alex, about picking up people who voted leave to participate was an issue. I'm not sure how we square that circle. We tried several different ways of trying to get people to participate in the focus groups, and in the end, we were really trying to push to get leave voters. But unfortunately, maybe for the reasons you've already outlined, it did prove difficult. The second bullet point there, Brexit seemed largely as imposed by England. I mean, and again, that goes back to one of the earlier points you're making about this idea, is it Scotland versus England? And in some ways, within the Scottish narrative, you sometimes get this, where there seems to be a perception that if England, and really what's meant by England, I would say, is Westminster. If Westminster's going one way, then there's a knee-jerk reaction that Scotland is going to go the other way. And you sort of pick that up a little bit, but in one of the questions that the focus groups were asked, to what extent is Glasgow different than other cities in England? It was quite obvious that certainly cities such as Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle, and one or two did say Birmingham, they did feel as though there was similarities in terms of the declining manufacturing industry in particular, leading to situations where, I mean, we've used the phrase left behind, but it wasn't really that. It was more a case of that, when you dug down deeper into unpick the England versus Scotland, there was a recognition in some of the focus groups that certainly cities in the north of England had similar issues as Glasgow. I think across the board, well, apart from the two leave voters, nobody could see a positive to Brexit in terms of what the impact would be for Scotland and the UK. And of course, interestingly, within the Scottish context, it was seen that the Brexit vote was actually fueling the flames for Scottish independence to push devolution even further. And what you'd have to say there is, if the latest opinion polls, and we all know about opinion polls, but they are one indicator. They're certainly showing a majority view for independence at this moment in time. So that sort of viewpoint is being borne out, and of course, COVID is not actually helping Westminster's cause at this moment. The next slide, Alex, please.
Yep. So, I mean, this was I believe he was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. Do you want to read the quote out?
Yeah, sure. This is a guy, and this is something that's, I think, been lost a lot in the polarization of the Brexit debate that did happen. That there was a small but not insignificant left-wing movement, if you want, for want of a better word, which was actually trying to articulate an alternative view of what the EU stands for, and trying to articulate, and the participant here would advocate some kind of a Europe based on promoting more socialist principles, if you like. So, but they were trying to navigate a way in between the polarization that, if you were for Brexit, you were some right-wing nationalist, full stop. And you know, we've already articulated that we don't go along with that narrative in the same way that everybody who wanted to remain is some kind of progressive left winger. You know, that is too simple. But this quote, what it's articulating is trying to articulate a way through those two generalizations, those two polarized views, to try and suggest that actually the EU, as it stands, as you can see the phrase there, the bosses club, pointing to the way EU treated the Greek economy. Remember when the austerity crisis was on, Greece was trying to put forward an alternative platform, and the EU came along and squashed those aspirations. Fortress Europe, they built a wall. It's all right if you're rich, it's all right if you're white or rich. But if you're looking for refuge from the wars that the Western world has inflicted on the Middle East, then it's fuck you, the Irish word.
If you.
So, you know, so I think so. It's quite interesting to get that that argument into our findings, and like I say, for myself, I felt that argument was particularly lost at the time of the referendum.
Well, it's not insignificant, is it? Because if you were to say, and I don't know the exact figures, but if you were to say that 10% of people who voted Leave were so-called left-wing Brexiters, Lexiteers, that is enough in itself. You know, 1.7 million to more or less swing an election result, a referendum result, isn't it? So it is not an insignificant phenomenon, and it points to the broader diversity of views underpinning someone's decision to vote Leave.
Exactly.
It's almost an old Bennite Labour view in itself.
Well, I mean, you know, I'm old enough to remember the first referendum, the 1974 one, and I actually had it was the first election I actually voted in, and I did have a poster up in the garden: "Quit the market, join the world." You know, so that was my view at that particular moment in time.
So you were a Leaver in 1974.
Well, yeah, but again, you know, I was very much influenced by I wouldn't have disagreed with the sentiments that are in this quote at that moment in time. That's for sure. I think it was like, we don't really want to get get diverted onto my political developments.
But I mean, it's a historical aside, but it is fascinating to go back to that referendum and look at the geographical spread of the vote. In some ways, it was inverted from today.
Well, I mean, if you want to look back at that 1974 thing, I mean, I think there was the left and the Labour Party. What was much more organised, and as you said, it was Tony Benn that was sort of leading the campaign on the left, and so there was more of a, in inverted commas, an established left narrative that was being articulated, which got greater airtime, greater publicity. I mean, the views expressed in my participant 5 here, I would imagine anybody listening who had actually heard this sort of argument, you know, would be, I would suggest, even, you know, we've got an engaged audience here, people who've been following the debate. I would guess there's not a lot of people that would have picked up on this sort of argument in the course of that last referendum debate.
Well, we'll move on. Now, this is an interesting one to me in terms of national debates on the so-called North-South divide in England, because what was coming out from our respondents was, particularly in Dudley, a strong notion that the Midlands were largely overlooked in the national political arena. And it's very fascinating just to see what people's perceptions of regional figures are. And so for some of our respondents, it was noted in terms of the prominence of Manchester, with Andy Burnham having a particularly high profile at the moment, whereas Andy Street in the West Midlands less so. And another issue that did come out, and one argument that's been put around the notion of left behind, is the decline of volume-based manufacturing, and manufacturing as an employer of large numbers of people. If you take a microcosm of that, in Dudley, of course, the Mary Hill shopping centre was once the site of a steelworks. Yeah, and that legacy of structural change has contributed to feelings of being left behind and underinvested in. And that certainly did come out in the research. So, participant number 5 here, for example, commenting that, it's especially suffered from the decline of industry. Manufacturing industry, it really has, and it's in a way, a lot of the landscape is in a waste, which has been wasteland from the declined industry. And a lot of the resentments and anger that you have locally in Brexit has come from that. In terms of the sort of profile of the region and the national debate, another participant here suggested that, for example, I did hope that when West Midlands Metro Mayor Andy Street got elected, that might change, but no, that doesn't seem to be the case. You see more of that guy from Manchester on the television, very rarely anything to do with the Midlands. For example, Channel 4 not coming to the West Midlands and then going to the North. I think that we are massively underrepresented. So the notion of the West Midlands as being somehow underrepresented or left behind in national discourse is an interesting one. And the perception of relative economic decline actually has quite a solid basis. In fact, when you compare the economic performance of the north of England to the Midlands, in the north of England, relative economic decline has been principally driven by relative decline in population growth. Whereas in the Midlands, relative economic decline has almost overwhelmingly been driven by a fall in economic performance as opposed to population movements. That's quite significant, because when you look at the distribution of the Leave vote across England, you do very much see a sort of missing middle effect. The areas that voted most strongly for Brexit are largely clustered in a sort of arc going from Lincolnshire through the West Midlands, Stoke, parts of Wales, down into the southwest. So simple debates around a north-south divide, I think, miss the point in that regard. That the performance of these regions of England have had very different experiences in some ways over the last 30 years. And the West Midlands is especially notable from having gone from being the second or the third wealthiest region in England in 1975, at the height of its manufacturing peak, to only 6 years later dropping down to the second worst, I think it was. And I think, when you have that kind of relative economic decline in such a short period, that really leaves a lasting imprint on people. So in some sense, this doesn't surprise me. You look at the regional economy at the moment, I won't read out all of this, but I think suffice to say, if you can make out the figures here, prior to COVID-19 hitting, the official unemployment rate in the city of Birmingham was 9%. These are local labour market statistics provided by NOMIS. If you then add the number of so-called economically inactive people who want a job, your adjusted unemployment rate at the time for Birmingham would have been about 15%. That's a pattern that's been existing for quite a while, certainly over the last 10 years. And it mirrors the decline of volume-based manufacturing in the region. And you get a similar story there for Coventry, Sandwell, etc., Dudley. Another aside, but if you were to ask me what's the impact of COVID-19 done since then, the simple statistics across the West Midlands Combined Authority area, which is all those municipalities you see listed there, Birmingham, Coventry, Dudley, Sandwell, Solihull, Walsall, Wolverhampton. If we take claimant count, those receiving universal credit as a proxy for the unemployed, a reasonably accurate one, then you can see here that in the space of 6 months through January to July of this year, the numbers of those on universal credit essentially, have doubled. So that's a doubling on top of the, for an argument's sake, for Birmingham, 14% adjusted unemployment rate. So Back to you, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks. I've just got a technical issue. That's why I was jumping about. Hopefully I've resolved it. But if I disappear, it's because I'm struggling with the technology here. But anyway.
You're loud and clear at the moment.
I think, again, this trying to pick up on whether there was this feeling of left behind. There's certainly very strong views that Westminster didn't care about Scotland as a whole, and this was right across the piece. This was, you know, the Leave voters and Remain voters certainly felt this, but having said that, there was incredibly strong support for Holyrood and what Holyrood was able to articulate in terms of representing Scotland. We'll see on the next slide. There's a slight difference on this, but I think Holyrood have been able to counter this sort of being left behind in some respects, because of the legitimacy that Holyrood has amongst the people of Scotland. Whereas, like I say, Westminster seemed far too far removed. I mean, just outside the scope of the research, there's certainly a feeling in some of the outer reaches of Scotland. You know, I'm thinking of the Western Isles, for example. They certainly don't have any strong allegiance to Westminster, but they also feel disenfranchised from Holyrood to some degree, and there's been surveys done that have reflected that. So when we're thinking, you know, in this context of Scotland, I guess, and the feeling of that Holyrood represents them, you know, we are talking about principally the Scottish mainland, I would suggest. So there is that second bullet point is telling us there is that strong political divide, Westminster associated with Tory governments, which of course in the recent past it has been. Want to move on, Alex? So as I was saying a moment ago, clear majority of participants had a favourable view of Holyrood, and you know, though the non-SNP supporters felt too much focus on independence, and again, this came strongly from the couple of from some of the the two of the Leave voters were articulating this. One from the East Dunbartonshire was quite vociferous in terms of spending too much time on independence and not doing the day job. But like you say, there is this majority that certainly feel that Holyrood represented their concerns, whereas not one of the participants in Scotland felt that Westminster was representative of their particular views. So again, you know, when we think of Scotland, there is this, you know, because of the dominance of the SNP at this moment in time, you've always got to be well aware of the nuances that, whilst you can say that, yeah, everybody's proud to be Scottish, there is a dissenting view to what Holyrood is up to, particularly in relation to independence. On the next slide, Alex. Yeah, so like I say, you know, there is this feeling that yes, we're all proud to be Scottish. And again, this is one thing we must remember with the research. If we think of the size of the population of Scotland, the whole country, the population is probably the size of West Midlands. So so in some ways, it's not surprising that, you know, Scotland population-wise is not a big country, so you can see that there is this perception and this feeling of proud to be Scottish. That there will be caveats there, because what that actually means would mean differences to different people within Scotland. Probably depends on whether you follow rugby or football, but that's another story again. And what was interesting, there was this feeling of belonging. For everybody in that we spoke to, all participants felt as though they belonged to their community. And how do you demonstrate that? How do you try and quantify that statement? And of course, one way you can do it, well, do you belong to any local groups? Do you belong to any local organisations? And many did, but there was substantial number that didn't belong to any particular local group or anything. Yet they still felt a belonging. They did, and they did feel as though there was, that they belonged in their community, even though there was no tangible evidence. So in terms of actual membership of any campaigning groups or local bodies, local golf clubs, bowling clubs, or anything like this. Yes, some people were involved in those types of organisations, but even though the ones that weren't still felt the sense of belonging. This is me reading into the research a little bit. I mean, there did seem to be a deficit at the local authority level. So there's that strong alignment with Holyrood, but in terms of the local authority, that became something of an indifference to the local authority, and demonstrated in: can you name your local councillor? No. Can you name your Holyrood MP? Yes. Can you name your Westminster MP? Not sure. So there is that, like I said, there is that deficit at the very local level, I would suggest.
Yeah, I mean, we get similar results here in that sense. I mean, if you, I'll pick up on that in two levels. The local authority one is an interesting one, because ultimately local authorities are just creations of central government, and they've been chopped and changed over the years. So, the great restructuring of '74, I think, was what created East Dunbartonshire into the thing that it is now. It's essentially a series of commuter suburbs for Glasgow that are not really joined to each other. The east of the borough and the west of the borough have no real connection. They gravitate into the Glasgow hub in a similar fashion to some extent that the peri-urban boroughs around Birmingham do as well, with Birmingham being the centre of tertiary sectors of employment. But I mean, that's an interesting one. I mean, there is no, from what I can see, there is no semblance of regional identity in the West Midlands. Nobody calls themselves a West Midlander or from the Midlands. 1,300 years ago, we had the Kingdom of Mercia. But I mean, the regional element in England has been largely discounted and broken up since the Norman Conquest. So what we see is a local identity appears to be more important. I mean, certainly Dudley is part of the Black Country, so called because of its legacy of metal bashing and smokestacks. People have a very strong local identity in that sense, but it's not really related to perceptions of the local authority. I mean, the local authority largely is who you pay your council tax to. But regional identity distinctly lacking in that sense. You're from the Black Country and you're English, and the particularism gets quite distinct. We've done similar studies in town hall meetings in Sutton Coldfield, where they are quite keen to tell you they are not Brummies, because of the residual memory of the Royal Metropolitan Borough of Sutton Coldfield. So that then, in my mind, coming back to the central question around devolution, that's an important thing itself, because Scotland has an obvious cultural and national identity and the sort of very strong awareness of having once been a separate country, whereas you don't get that in the regions of England as a rule. In fact, in terms of how they're currently defined in terms of the government office regions, the only one that has a distinct organic feel to it is Yorkshire, whereas the rest have somewhat sterile sounding names like North East and South West, that don't really evoke any kind of history. And so you tend to get more locally based identity, Cornwall, Lancashire, etc. You sort of get distinct perceptions out of that. Mancunian, as you know yourself.
Indeed.
Yep. An Australian in Birmingham and a Mancunian in Scotland. So to me then, that was one of the most interesting questions, and of course is the attitudes to devolution. Devolution as we have it in England essentially at the moment is built around the notion of combined authorities and metro mayors. And so what really came out of this research was that, for most of our participants, when asked to comment on that, they saw them as pretty limited in scope and lacking sufficient powers or resources. As one person framed it, I can't name any single thing that Andy Street has done. And related to that were questions raised by a number of our participants in terms of the legitimacy of these regional bodies and democratic accountability. One participant went so far as to suggest that what we have at the moment is not sufficient and should be replaced with a regional assembly of elected members. If you consider the sort of plethora of regional bodies that we have at the moment, they're rather opaque in terms of how they're governed. We have things here called LEPs, local enterprise partnerships, which do have some resource raising ability, but they're not democratically accountable. They're creatures of central government. And indeed, in that context, then not surprising then that evident was some degree of confusion over the actual geographic coverage of these bodies. For example, some of our participants in Dudley equated the combined authority with Birmingham. The view that Andy Street was the mayor of Birmingham, not the mayor of the West Midlands urban area. And you can take that argument one step further. It's what is the West Midlands? If it's a government office region, it includes Shropshire, Herefordshire, Worcestershire, Warwickshire. If you talk about the West Midlands combined authority, it is synonymous basically with the old metropolitan county of the West Midlands. And so all these things were picked up on people. So it shouldn't be surprising then that there was some degree of confusion over this. And as this transcript dialogue here demonstrates in reference to Andy Street, he's the West Midlands mayor? Yeah, I thought he was just Birmingham. No, he covers the combined authority. Well, I guess in that sense, he doesn't represent me at all. I didn't even realise he was our mayor. Well, he's different from, say, the Dudley mayor because he's mayor of the big area. Well, couldn't even tell you what he looks like, and it's not like I don't watch the news. I watch it 3 times a day. I genuinely thought he was just Birmingham because of the trams in the centre of town now and that train thing, i.e. HS2. So, sorry, Chick, I don't really know what to say for this one because he clearly doesn't do a fat lot over in these ends, does he? So, if you were going to take that as a typical view on successive devolution or otherwise, there are clearly issues there. Entities which are somewhat limited in their scope, as seen by our participants, and confusion over to what their actual geographic coverage is. I suppose in fairness to the mayor, I mean, his budget nearly is almost, the only real chunk that he has is for transport, and so big ticket items like HS2 and the Metropolitan Light Rail network are big items for him. But that's the sort of feedback we're getting coming through here. And so, I mean, to try and wrap it up, because I think we have a few questions, so I'm going to leave some time in for those. We try to explore issues around governance arrangements and the motives underpinning the Brexit vote. Our findings, I think, do suggest that lack of regional governments in England could be a key factor, as evidenced by support from our participants here in the West Midlands for further devolution to enable greater accountability and a transfer of power and resources to areas that feel left behind. And so, I mean, I'd be quite clear in this. I think we need to have further meaningful devolution occur in English regions. From my perspective, I think, without any disrespect to Scotland, if an area of 5.5 million people can have complete policy autonomy in key areas like health, education, agriculture, I think, public health, transport infrastructure, then why can't a coterminous economic unit of 5 million people, such as the West Midlands, have the same thing? Now, I mean, you know, there is a case that needs to be made there, and to date, it's not been done very well. So further research certainly could explore that in other regions of England and Wales. We tried to get a participant from Wales onto the panel today, but our academic colleagues, for the most part, are under some duress for teaching, so unfortunately we couldn't do that. But you know, we can certainly look further in other areas. And I think also, as we approach the end of membership of the Single Market and Customs Union at the end of this year, it's certainly within our scope of possibility for us to do further focus groups next year to sort of track how people feel once Brexit, in a sense, becomes real, you know, in an economic sense. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there is a proactive case to be made for so-called action research to engage more with the public on the merits of further devolution. I use the term anti-NESNO there. I wonder if anyone knows what NESNO stands for. Well, NESNO, of course, was the campaign, excuse me, in 2004 in the Northeast against an elected regional assembly for the Northeast. NESNO is Northeast says no. And another interesting bit of trivia for you here, who was the lead in the NESNO group? One Dominic Cummings. So that referendum was interesting in that despite the public polls that suggested a clear majority of people in the Northeast favoured some form of devolution, at the end of the day, the turnout was a resounding defeat of a low turnout. I suppose that the Blair government and the Iraq war at the time was not ideal for them to try and push the case for devolution in that region, but you know, devolution doesn't just happen. You know, devolution needs a proactive case, especially when you have the Westminster government at the moment, you know, seemingly determined to centralise more power, as the currently shelved proposals to abolish district authorities in the shires of England would attest. So I'm going to stop it on that note. Thank you for listening. I think we have some questions there. Where can I get the live Q&A session? All right, let's have a look. I'll pick up on Daniel. The Brexiteers in England say we want and need independence from Brussels, no matter what. The SNP in Scotland say we want and need independence from Westminster, no matter what. Sinn Féin says we want a united Ireland, no matter what. These three arguments and wishes are there regardless of rational arguments about trade, economy, and difficult negotiations. Do you agree with me that all these three movements, with all these differences, have something important in common? They are fundamentally driven by emotions and history. Jeff, any thoughts there?
Well, sir, I can see what Daniel's argument is. I guess the way you'd answer it is or to make a comment towards it, would be to say, but the issues of independence, issues around United Ireland, issues of Brexiteers, you know, they do ebb and flow. So, for example, what I mean by that is that, you know, if you look at Scottish independence, the last independence referendum, there wasn't the majority there. So at what point, you know, so there is this ebb and flow, and I guess it goes back to the point you ended with, Alex, that you really need a consistent movement and a consistent building of hegemony for these issues to be borne out. So whilst there has been small numbers of people that have campaigned for endlessly on these issues, on from a historical perspective and a political perspective, the actual majority view on that does ebb and flow through a period of time. So if you're going to achieve those goals, then you do need that consistent argument, and you need the consistent building of a movement behind it, consistent, like you say, that this idea of achieving counter arguments to the dominant narrative that comes from Brussels and Westminster, if these movements are going to be borne out.
Okey-doke. Let's see. Tony. Comment here from Tony, I think. Participant 5 makes an interesting point, but surely in this respect, the EU is reflecting the makeup of its members. Leaving the EU does not therefore address the issue of concern of participant 5. No, I suppose not. But I mean, leaving the EU does not address many issues relating to uneven development and feeling left behind. Far from it. You know, those policy areas are the preserve of Westminster for the most part. Comment here from Dick. Is elected regional government...
Alex,
sorry?
Just on that point though, you know, I mean, one of the big problems for EU is the democratic deficit.
Yeah.
In terms, and so whether the EU is actually reflecting the views of its membership, are we talking about membership countries, or are we talking about the citizens of the EU? You know, so that's...
Yeah, I mean, that democratic deficit argument is an interesting one, and it's obviously beyond the scope of this discussion, but I do recall meeting a Leave voter once, a vicar, funnily enough, and they said the reason they voted to leave the EU was because there wasn't enough democracy in the EU, and what they wanted was to directly elect EU leaders.
Mm.
Yeah. So Dick here says, is elected regional government of English regions with economic power as many other European regions? The answer, I'm a Keenie, Dick. I think that means you're in support there. Yep. Comment here from Kevin. Is not part of the decline in our manufacturing base is the lack of prestige for engineering and education. I lived in Germany 2000 to 2001, and the technical schools were teaching engineering skills to secondary school students. Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for that argument, Kevin. You know, as someone who's taught in business schools over the years, you know, there's very much a bias towards, you know, in the professional services, I think, and a sort of devaluing of technical education, you know, the engineering is somehow being dirty and low grade, which of course is nonsense, but that perception is there, and there's certainly more that government could do to promote STEM. And of course, in terms of contemporary manufacturing, you know, skill shortages are going to be a key issue if the heavy reliance that we see on EU workers, if that supply of workers dries up as a result of Brexit. Question here from Michael. Do you have any thoughts or evidence on the role of local media in all of this? Very interesting question. Yes, feelings of being left behind, influencing political behaviour. This is a very interesting question. We didn't pick up on this directly. I mean, it's another hypothesis that may explain some of the divergence in Scotland, particularly when you look at the percentage of people who did not vote in the referendum. You know, if you take Dudley, the turnout was about 70%, yet in Glasgow, it was only about 50%. You know, there were a big chunk of people who we, in terms of our own research, we could not reach, those who did not vote. Now, I mean, why? You know, it's certainly obvious that the Sun newspaper has a very different slant in Scotland than what it does in England. I mean, it's markedly anti-SNP in England, but in Scotland it's a lot more muted in its criticism. Maybe that's a factor. Maybe the way that the Vote Leave campaign targeted particular areas to encourage people to vote, maybe that was a factor too. But I mean, it's not something we can comment on in this research, but certainly interesting area for further inquiry. Now here's another comment. Sorry, I don't know if I can pick up on all of these necessarily, but we'll keep going for a few minutes longer. You know, people can log on and log off as they wish. That's the advantage of this format, I guess. Comment here from Vicky. Aside from politics, why was economics so much more important in the Scottish vote, as was shown in Alex's slide, than in England in the Brexit referendum? Is it because economics was the deciding factor in the Scottish independence referendum too, or are the Scots simply more economic savvy, Jeff?
Word on the street seems to suggest that. I'm not sure there's... I don't know, to be honest. I think it's a very, very good question. It's something I haven't thought of, so it's a really, really good question. I'll have to think about that one. I'm not sure to what extent you can actually disentangle the economics from the political in that way, particularly in the case of Scotland.
Now, I'll pick up on another comment here from, this is from Tony. How can we turn disenchantment with centralism in England, into support for local government and devolution, given that even in Scotland, the attachment was to Holyrood, not City Hall? What are the positive identities we can build on?
Well, I mean, my theory here is that you've got to really look at the reform of the tax system, because currently there's only a small proportion of council tax which is actually determined at the local level. In other words, there's only a small proportion of the amount of council tax that you actually pay that is determined by your local authority. The majority of council tax is made up of the block grant from Westminster. So therefore, until you can get some kind of real meaningful discussion over issues of how tax can be raised and spent locally, well, that would be one way of getting greater engagement. And then you're looking at other ways of trying to engage the population. So things like participatory budgeting may well help. And things like in Scotland, you've got the Community Empowerment Act, which has had a significant influence in some communities, which have led to community buyouts, for example, of physical buildings, of land and what have you. And once you get that engagement directly with the local population, the decision making becomes meaningful. Then that's when you'll get greater participation at a local level, I would suggest.
Yeah, another comment here from Tony, question. In the West Midlands, the component municipalities, I think he means, have stronger identities. Black Country, Birmingham, Coventry. How do we build on these within the institutional structure that we have? I mean, the West Midlands Combined Authority Area one, of course, as I think Tony alludes, is interesting in that one municipality, Birmingham City Council, you know, accounts for almost half of the population of the Combined Authority Area. So the other smaller municipalities are certainly very guarded in terms of seeing Birmingham as the epicenter. I think that's an interesting question. I don't know, it's a simple answer in terms of how you do that in the short term, but I think what's come out of our research is that the notion that the peri-urban fringes don't seem to count for as much. And I think maybe there is a question for the combined authority in terms of increasing its visibility across other parts of the combined authority area to get around the notion that it's a Birmingham creature. Maybe that would help to ensure greater buy-in. Maybe coordinating with the three LEPs, I think, that cover the area in that regard. I don't know, but I certainly think there's a PR case here around, you know, pointing out to the residents of the combined authority area that it is something that represents everybody in all those municipalities and not just one. Jeff, I'll let you answer this question because I've got a plug in my power cable. I've just forgotten it. Was there any sense that Brexit is actually a power grab which will over time undermine devolution, as well as Westminster tries to take back power from the devolved nations and regions?
A power grab. I guess it's really dependent on a power grab by whom. This is not. This is a politician's answer, and I apologise for that. But something that always strikes me as being significant. I think that what's happened with the Brexit referendum is that for many people, there was a feeling that this time their vote would count. This time they had a voice, so they were determined to go out and get that voice heard. And the big problem is, can that be replicated? And therefore, the questions we've been looking at in terms of greater devolution across England, but also to get greater engagement at a local level in Scotland. You're looking at how to get that greater participation within the process. And I apologise, I'm not really answering your question there, but I'm a bit unclear with what, in terms of this whole idea of power grab.
Another comment, should we start to think more critically of the notion of left behind now, particularly for how it feeds right-wing populist appeal to narratives of victimhood?
Well, I mean, yeah. I think, the problem, the way the political process has worked, and to be honest, I would certainly lay this at the door of the Labour Party, and I would go back to Tony Blair, because if you look at the so-called Red Wall, which crumbled at the last general election, to me, the Labour Party under Blair made a political calculation that what mattered was targeting voters in the southeast of England, and the northern seats, and indeed I'm including Birmingham. For England, the north starts at Watford, I'm afraid. But Blair targeted and put resources into getting people in the southeast of England to vote Labour, in the belief that people in the north would always vote Labour anyway. And so to me, there's been a complete neglect. I experienced this, funnily enough, when I'm originally from Manchester. I lived 11 years in London, and you saw it in Tower Hamlets. Tower Hamlets, East London, solid Labour when I went down there. Gradually, what happened to that Labour majority in terms of the council, it was lost and it went to the Lib Dems. Why did that happen? Well, you phoned up to join the Labour Party in Tower Hamlets and they turned around and said, sorry, we're full. And you had a Labour Party which consisted of probably 12 people, ward meetings, 12 people, or constituency Labour Party meetings, 12 people, divvying up who was going to be standing for the councillor, divvying up who was going to be the MP, and it became a rotten borough. And that, to me, has been reflected in a lot of the so-called left behind areas where the Labour Party have just neglected the needs of the local population, and they've had a bloody nose over it, as far as I can see. Coupled with the collapse of the traditional manufacturing base, what was important about that was that you had strong trade union membership, and when you had a strong trade union membership, you had an alternative format for debate and discussion to get out. So, for example, we'll take the mining communities. Whatever the NUM said, rightly or wrongly, and that became the gospel in many ways. So the NUM was able to counteract a lot of the right-wing media, because there was a strong belief in what the NUM would do for the miners, etc. And therefore there was that counter-argument being put on a daily basis. Like I say, with the collapse of the mines, NUM disappears. There's been nothing to fill that void, which can give growth to the populism which the question refers to.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, you see a similar vote trend. I mean, the collapse of the Red Wall, as you say, is not something that's taken place all of a sudden. But the vote share was diminishing in many of these areas over the last 3 or 4 elections, as you point out. Seats like West Bromwich West and West Bromwich East here in Birmingham, for example. David says, do you think that a federal government structure would help solve the problem that the UK is the most centralised government in Europe? Yeah, I think it would. I think it would go, I'm saying it's a panacea, but I think a I think that the more sort of localised you can get and the more attendant transfer of power and resources, I think would go some way towards a genuine levelling up. I think, you know, under the current setup, we have a situation whereby, if you take one example, per capita transport spending is about 4 times as much in London as it is here in the Midlands. You know, I mean, that's, and again, when you look at education spending, you see similar divergences between London and the rest of England in terms of education funding per capita. So I do think that a federal structure where you had regional governments that had power and the ability to command resources over those areas would go a long way to sort of equalising outcomes in the country. Kevin says, I'm 69 and in Thailand and denied a referendum vote. I mean, there was an issue there, of course. Considers himself European, doesn't want to be associated with our past. Well, do we need a West Midlands flag? Well, I mean, this is from Dick. I mean, the Black Country certainly has a flag. I mean, the chain flag, the red, white and black one that some of you listeners may have seen. Tony says, perhaps a balanced double devolution, giving more powers to both local authorities and the mayor / combined authority. Certainly communities need to feel closer to local authorities. Agree on fiscal devolution. Tony, thank you, would agree with those comments. Another Tony says, I suspect Claire's question is on the right line. Certainly as far as the current government is concerned, it would have made more sense to spend 2016 devising ways of devolving more powers from Westminster instead of trying to resolve what was essentially an internal Tory party problem by holding an ill-conceived referendum. And we have a comment to a final comment, and then we're going to wrap it up here from Mark. It says, thanks for that. On this happy note, you've taken me from cocky ignorance to miserable uncertainty. And on that happy note, folks, I'd like to thank you all for participating. We can make our presentations available to those who'd like to see them. Again, I hope this has been some illumination. You know, as academics, we're trained to be somewhat limited in our conclusions, and it's always interesting to go and do more research to plumb these attitudes better. But we are going to be doing this on a monthly basis, and as we head towards the exit of the single market and the customs union, we'll certainly be having an update in those areas. So please visit our website and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn to keep up to date with the latest news. And certainly, I'd like to thank you all for listening. I'd like to thank Bethan and Poppy for the background in organising, and Jeff and Arantxa, I'd like to thank you for your contributions as well. So thank you, folks, and good day to you. Goodbye.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers.